Yeah, so my name is Isabel Gable, and I'm a historian of science and political thought. I received my PhD at Columbia University in New York, and I was also a pre-doctoral fellow at the Max Planck Institute for the History of Science, and I've held postdoctoral positions at the University of Chicago and the University of Pennsylvania's Perelman School of Medicine. And my primary research interests are in the exchanges between the sciences and the humanities and social sciences. I'm especially interested in how scientific uncertainty and scientific ideas about the limits of knowledge become politically meaningful in the 20th century. My first book, which I'm currently completing, is about the connections between French biology and French liberalism, beginning with Neo-Lamarckism and Raymond Aron, and going up through the works of Jacques Monod and Francois Jacob, and even Michel Foucault in through the 1970s. And my newer work is on the history of complexity in the natural and human sciences. So that's sort of a summary of my research interests as well as my biography. When I think back to how I first discovered the work of Canguilhem, it goes to 2008 when I was beginning my graduate studies in New York City. I had heard of him, but I hadn't really, he wasn't on my radar, as we say. And it was Stefanos Gerilanos, who at the time had just joined the faculty at New York University, just downtown, who I was starting to also work with in my studies. And he had just completed this translation into English with Daniela Ginsberg of the La Connaissance de la Vie. And I remember that I read those essays in English originally, and I was just so fascinated by them. Just they were so precise, so carefully argued, and at the same time, so radical and surprising if you read them carefully. But they required such care, I thought. And they made these claims that were just to me so profound and surprising, even knowing what I knew about the history and philosophy of biology, which was where my research was. And so for me, this original first reading of those essays just totally cracked open a new way to think about these long problems in the history of the life sciences. And in fact, I realized this today, I was remembering, it was through Canguilhem and reading through just kind of looking through things he had published that I got to my entire book project, because it was in one of his, a remembrance of his friend, Aron, that he mentions that Raymond Aron had also studied early on, had studied Mendelian genetics. And so that kind of like led me to my whole project. So I also have a lot of gratitude to Canguilhem, yeah. So, but it was quite a while ago in 2008. So this is, I'd say the most important aspect of being physically in the Canguilhem collection for me was the ability to really experience the enormity of Canguilhem's mind and therefore his contribution to philosophy and to the history of biology. Um, so before the project that I know has now been underway for a while of publishing his complete works had come to much fruition, I think it was hard to grasp how enormous um, his accomplishments were, just because the scale was not reflected in the published works yet. And I also think there's something inherently valuable in having access to all of these things at once, right? To just being in a place where everything um, he produced and much of what he read is present. And reading, and especially reading his lecture notes and his reading notes. So because I perceive Canguilhem, and maybe others disagree, but I perceive him as someone whose published work was so unbelievably polished. It was so finished. airtight and precise and tightly argued, and each step of his argument comes to seem almost inevitable because he's crafts these like really beautiful, precise arguments. And I think being in the archive, especially if you have some real time to spend there, you can get a much richer sense of what went into making these philosophical works. You can see, for example, oh, here in 1965 is when he becomes interested in information theory, and this is when he reads Erwin Schrödinger and thinks about negative entropy, or this is when he reads Raymond Aron's philosophy of history, and you can see a parallel in how they're thinking about contingency and the political valence of contingency. So I think the experience of being in the archive goes beyond even what could be accomplished in a digital archive, although of course digital archives are wonderful, but just because you get a sense of the context and the enormous intellectual labor that went into producing these philosophical achievements. So you can, I think it's not just that you discover things, because of course you discover things, but it's that you get a picture of what goes into and what went into making these contributions that he made. And it's just really exciting and fun. I mean, that's the other thing, to be able to be present with the notes and the thought of somebody you're so invested and interested in. So I'm going to read one paragraph from Aspects of Vitalism. And the reason I chose this paragraph, there's so many pieces I could have chosen, and this is probably quite a famous one. But for me, this paragraph captures what I find to be so fascinating about the connection between epistemology and politics, but politics not in the simple way of interest or interest groups, but the profound political meaning of what Canguilhem was doing when he thought about the specificity of biology. So this is from Aspects of Vitalism, and I'm going to read it the English. So this is the translation from Stefanos Karolanos and Daniela Ginsberg from 2008. In short, the classical vitalist accepts the insertion of a living organism into a physical milieu, to whose laws it constitutes an exception. Therein lies, in our opinion, the philosophically inexcusable fault. There cannot be an empire within an empire without there being no longer any empire, neither container nor contents. There can only be one philosophy of empire, that which refuses any division: imperialism. The imperialism of physicists or chemists is thus perfectly logical, pushing to its limits the expansion of logic or the logic of expansion. One cannot defend the originality of the biological phenomenon, and consequently the originality of biology, by demarcating it within the physico-chemical territory. That is, within the milieu of inertia of externally determined movements, enclaves of indeterminism, zones of dissidence, or foyers of heresy. If one is to assert the originality of the biological, this must be in terms of the originality of one realm over the whole of experience. This must be, and not over islets of experience. In the end, classical vitalism sins paradoxically only in its excessive modesty, in its reluctance to universalize its conception of experience.